On the morning of September 11, 2001, 19 men boarded 4 commercial aircraft with the intention of carrying out the most devastating terrorist attack in American history. The events that unfolded that day would forever change the United States and the world, reshaping foreign policy, domestic security measures, and the collective psyche of a nation. To understand the full scope of what happened on 9/11, we must examine not only the events of that tragic day, but also the complex web of circumstances, decisions, and failures that made such an attack possible. The story begins years before September 11, 2001, in the mountains of Afghanistan and the training camps of al-Qaeda. Osama bin Laden, the son of a wealthy Saudi construction magnate, had transformed from a young man fighting Soviet occupation in Afghanistan during the 1980s into the leader of a global terrorist network. His organization, al-Qaeda, meaning the base in Arabic, had been responsible for numerous attacks against American interests throughout the 1990s, including the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, the 1998 embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania, and the 2000 attack on the USS Cole in Yemen. Bin Laden's grievances against the United States were multifaceted and deeply rooted in his interpretation of Islamic theology and geopolitics. He viewed the presence of American troops in Saudi Arabia, home to Islam's holiest sites, as a desecration of sacred land. He opposed American support for Israel and what he perceived as American oppression of Muslims worldwide. His ultimate goal was to drive American influence from the Middle East and establish a pan-Islamic caliphate governed by his strict interpretation of Islamic law. The roots of bin Laden's radicalization can be traced back to his experiences during the Soviet-Afghan War of the 1980s. Born into one of Saudi Arabia's wealthiest families, bin Laden initially seemed destined for a life of privilege and business success. His father, Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden, had built a construction empire that made the family billionaires through contracts with the Saudi royal family. However, the younger bin Laden was drawn to religious extremism and the cause of jihad against what he perceived as foreign occupation of Muslim lands. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, bin Laden saw an opportunity to put his beliefs into action. He traveled to Pakistan and Afghanistan, where he used his family's wealth to fund Mujahideen fighters and establish training camps. During this period, he worked closely with the Pakistani intelligence service and received indirect support from the CIA, which was backing the Afghan resistance as part of its Cold War strategy against the Soviet Union. The experience of fighting alongside the Mujahideen and witnessing what he believed was the defeat of a superpower had a profound impact on bin Laden's worldview. He became convinced that dedicated Islamic fighters could defeat any enemy, no matter how powerful, if they were willing to sacrifice their lives for their cause. This belief would later inform his strategy of using asymmetric warfare and suicide attacks against the United States. After the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan in 1989, bin Laden returned to Saudi Arabia, where he initially enjoyed hero status for his role in the conflict. However, his relationship with the Saudi government began to deteriorate when Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990. Bin Laden offered to organize an army of Mujahideen veterans to defend Saudi Arabia against potential Iraqi aggression, but the Saudi royal family instead chose to invite American troops to be stationed in the kingdom. This decision outraged bin Laden, who viewed the presence of non-Muslim troops in the land of Islam's holiest sites as a profound violation of religious law. He began speaking out against the Saudi government and the American military presence, leading to increasing tensions with the authorities. In 1991, he was forced to leave Saudi Arabia and eventually settled in Sudan, where he continued to build his terrorist network. During his time in Sudan from 1991 to 1996, bin Laden expanded al-Qaeda's operations and began planning attacks against American targets. He established training camps, businesses to fund his operations, and connections with other terrorist groups around the world. It was during this period that he began to articulate his vision of a global jihad against the United States and its allies. The planning for what would become the September 11th attacks began in earnest in the late 1990s, after bin Laden had been forced to leave Sudan and return to Afghanistan. The Taliban, a fundamentalist Islamic movement that had taken control of most of Afghanistan, provided him with sanctuary and allowed him to establish extensive training facilities in the country. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the operational mastermind behind the plot, presented bin Laden with an ambitious plan to hijack commercial aircraft and use them as weapons against prominent American targets. Mohammed, who was the uncle of Ramzi Youssef, the mastermind of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, had been developing various terrorist plots for years and saw the potential for using aircraft as weapons to cause maximum destruction and psychological impact. The original concept was even more audacious than what was ultimately carried out, involving 10 aircraft and targets on both the east and west coasts. The plan called for simultaneous attacks on the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, the White House, the Capitol, the CIA headquarters, nuclear power plants, and other high-profile targets. However, bin Laden eventually decided to scale back the operation to 4 planes and 4 targets, believing that a smaller operation would be easier to coordinate and less likely to be detected by intelligence agencies. The selection of hijackers was a meticulous process that took place over several years. Al-Qaeda recruiters identified potential operatives in mosques, universities, and Islamic centers across Europe and the Middle East. They sought individuals who could blend into Western society, had clean criminal records, and possessed the necessary language skills and cultural knowledge to navigate American society without arousing suspicion. The recruitment process often began with identifying young men who showed signs of religious extremism or anger at perceived injustices against Muslims. These individuals would be gradually introduced to more radical ideas and eventually invited to training camps in Afghanistan, where they would receive indoctrination and military training. Only the most committed and capable recruits would be selected for major operations like the September 11th attacks. The 19 men who would ultimately carry out the attacks came from 4 different Arab countries, 15 from Saudi Arabia, 2 from the United Arab Emirates, 1 from Egypt, and 1 from Lebanon. Most were from middle-class families and had received good educations, contradicting the stereotype of terrorists as poor and uneducated. Several had studied in Western universities and were familiar with Western culture and customs. The hijackers were divided into 4 teams, each led by a trained pilot who had received flight training in the United States. Mohammed Atta, an Egyptian who had studied urban planning in Germany, emerged as the overall leader of the operation. Atta was a complex figure who had initially seemed to be pursuing a normal academic career before becoming radicalized and joining al-Qaeda. Born in 1968 in a small town in the Nile Delta, Atta was the son of a lawyer who had high expectations for his children's success. He was a serious student who excelled in his studies and seemed destined for a professional career. After completing his undergraduate degree in architecture at Cairo University, he received a scholarship to study urban planning at the Technical University of Hamburg in Germany. It was during his time in Germany that Atta began to embrace radical Islamic ideology. He became involved with a group of Arab students who shared his growing anger at what they perceived as Western oppression of Muslims. The group, which included several other future 9/11's hijackers, began meeting regularly to discuss their grievances and plan ways to take action against their perceived enemies. Atta's transformation from a quiet student to a terrorist leader was gradual but profound. He became increasingly religious and began to view the world in stark terms of good versus evil, with the West representing corruption and Islam representing purity. He made a pilgrimage to Mecca in 1995 which seemed to deepen his commitment to radical Islam, and began making contacts with al-Qaeda recruiters. The other pilot hijackers had similar backgrounds and followed similar paths to radicalization. Marwan al-Shihi from the United Arab Emirates had been Atta's roommate in Germany and was his closest associate in the plot. Hani Hanjar from Saudi Arabia had actually been in the United States since the early 1990s and had attended several flight schools, though his instructors had noted his poor flying skills. Ziad Jarrah from Lebanon came from a more secular background than the others, but had become radicalized while studying in Germany. These 4 men had all entered the United States legally on tourist or student visas and had enrolled in flight schools across the country, learning to pilot large commercial aircraft. Their flight training was often unremarkable, with instructors noting that they seemed more interested in learning to fly planes than in learning to take off or land them safely. This should have been a red flag, but the significance of this behavior was not recognized at the time. The remaining 15 hijackers, known as muscle hijackers, were responsible for overpowering the flight crews and passengers. Most of these men were young Saudis from middle-class families who had been radicalized in mosques and religious schools. They received basic training in al-Qaeda camps in Afghanistan, learning hand-to-hand combat techniques and how to use knives and other weapons that could pass through airport security screening. The muscle hijackers were generally less educated and sophisticated than the pilot hijackers, but they were chosen for their physical strength, dedication to the cause, and willingness to die for their beliefs. Many had been recruited through radical clerics who preached that dying in jihad was the highest form of religious devotion and would guarantee entry into paradise. Throughout 2000 and 2001, the hijackers gradually made their way to the United States, establishing themselves in various communities, particularly in Florida, California, and the Northeast. They lived relatively normal lives, renting apartments, opening bank accounts, and in some cases, even joining gyms and taking English classes. This careful preparation and their ability to blend into American society was crucial to the success of their mission. The hijackers' ability to remain undetected was aided by several factors. First, they had clean criminal records and valid visas, which allowed them to enter the country without arousing suspicion. Second, they were careful to avoid behavior that might draw attention from law enforcement or intelligence agencies. Third, the U.S. intelligence community was not adequately prepared to detect and prevent this type of attack. The intelligence community's failure to detect and prevent the September 11th attacks would later become the subject of extensive investigation and criticism. In the months and years leading up to the attacks, various agencies within the U.S. intelligence apparatus had gathered pieces of information that, when viewed in retrospect, painted a picture of an imminent threat. However, institutional barriers, communication failures, and analytical shortcomings prevented these agencies from connecting the dots and recognizing the full scope of the danger. The Central Intelligence Agency had been tracking several of the future hijackers, including Khalid al-Midhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, since early 2000. These 2 men had attended an al-Qaeda summit in Malaysia that was under CIA surveillance, but the agency failed to place them on terrorist watch lists or inform the Federal Bureau of Investigation that they had entered the United States. This failure would prove to be one of the most significant missed opportunities to prevent the attacks. The Malaysia meeting, which took place in January 2000, was attended by several key al-Qaeda operatives who were planning various attacks against American targets. The CIA had learned about the meeting through intercepts of communications between known terrorists and had arranged for Malaysian intelligence services to photograph and identify the attendees. However, the agency failed to recognize the significance of the meeting or to take appropriate follow-up action. Al-Midhar and al-Hazmi were photographed at the meeting and identified as potential terrorists. But this information was not shared with other agencies or used to prevent their entry into the United States. The two men flew from Malaysia to Thailand and then to Los Angeles, where they began preparing for their role in the September 11th attacks. They lived openly in California for more than a year, using their real names and even listing their address in the phone book. The FBI, meanwhile, had received reports from flight instructors who were suspicious of some of the hijackers' behavior during their training. The most notable case involved Zacarias Musawi, who was originally intended to be part of the plot, but was arrested in August 2001. Musawi had aroused suspicion at a Minnesota flight school when he expressed interest in learning to fly large aircraft, but showed little concern for learning how to take off or land. The flight instructor who reported Musawi's suspicious behavior told FBI agents that he was concerned about the man's intentions and suggested that he might be planning to use an aircraft as a weapon. However, FBI headquarters was skeptical of the field agent's concerns and refused to authorize a search of Musawi's computer, which contained information that could have exposed the entire plot. The failure to obtain a warrant to search Musawi's belongings was later identified as one of the most significant missed opportunities to prevent the attacks. The computer contained contact information for several of the other hijackers, details about flight training, and other evidence that could have led investigators to uncover the plot. However, FBI headquarters determined that there was insufficient evidence to justify a search warrant under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. The National Security Agency had intercepted communications suggesting that a major attack was being planned, including messages stating, "The match begins tomorrow, and tomorrow is 0 hour." However, these intercepts were not translated until after September 11th, highlighting the intelligence community's language and analytical capabilities shortfalls. The NSA was collecting vast amounts of communications intelligence, but lacked the resources and expertise to process and analyze it in a timely manner. The agency had also intercepted communications between al-Qaeda operatives discussing the big wedding, which investigators later determined was code for the September 11th attacks. However, the significance of these communications was not recognized at the time, and they were not given priority for translation and analysis. As the summer of 2001 progressed, there was a general sense within the intelligence community that al-Qaeda was planning something significant. CIA Director George Tenet later described the period as one where the system was blinking red. Intelligence reports indicated that terrorist attacks were imminent, but most analysts expected these attacks to occur overseas, targeting American embassies, military bases, or other facilities in the Middle East or South Asia. President George W. Bush received a presidential daily brief on August 6, 2001, titled Bin Laden Determined to Strike in U.S., which warned of the terrorist leader's intentions to attack within the United States. The brief mentioned that FBI information indicated patterns of suspicious activity in the country, consistent with preparations for hijackings or other types of attacks. However, the brief was largely historical in nature and did not contain specific information about the timing or method of the planned attacks. The August 6th brief would later become a source of significant controversy, with critics arguing that it provided clear warning of the impending attacks and that the Bush administration should have taken more aggressive action to prevent them. Supporters of the administration countered that the brief was too vague to justify specific preventive measures and that it did not provide actionable intelligence about the September 11th plot. The morning of September 11th, 2001, dawned clear and bright along the eastern seaboard. It was a Tuesday, and millions of Americans were beginning their daily routines, unaware that they were about to witness one of the most traumatic events in their nation's history. The weather was perfect for flying, with clear skies and light winds that would provide ideal conditions for the hijackers to carry out their mission. The hijackers had spent their final night in various locations, with some staying in hotels near the airports from which they would depart, while others remained in safe houses they had established during their months of preparation. They had been careful to maintain their cover identities until the very end, appearing to be ordinary travelers preparing for routine flights. Mohammed Atta and Abdul Aziz Al-Omari began their day in Portland, Maine, where they had traveled the previous day for reasons that remain unclear. Some investigators believe they may have chosen Portland because they thought security would be less stringent at the smaller airport, while others suggest it may have been an attempt to test the system or create confusion about their intentions. Whatever their reasoning, the two men caught an early morning flight from Portland to Boston's Logan International Airport, where they would connect to American Airlines Flight 11. The decision to travel through Portland added an element of risk to the operation, as it required the two men to make a connecting flight and increased the chances that they might be delayed or miss their intended flight. However, it also provided them with an opportunity to test airport security procedures and ensure that their weapons would not be detected during screening. At Logan Airport, Atta and Al-Omari met up with their three fellow hijackers, Wael al-Sherry, Walid al-Sherry, and Saddam al-Swakami. The five men passed through security screening without incident, despite some of them being selected for additional screening by the Computer-Assisted Passenger Prescreening System, CAPS. However, this additional screening in 2001 only applied to checked baggage, not to the passengers themselves or their carry-on items. The CAPS system was designed to identify passengers who might pose a security risk based on various factors, including their travel patterns, payment methods, and other characteristics. However, the system was primarily focused on preventing bombs from being placed in checked baggage and did not address the threat of hijacking. Even when passengers were selected for additional screening, they were still allowed to board their flights as long as their checked bags were screened for explosives. American Airlines Flight 11 was a Boeing 767-223ER scheduled to fly from Boston to Los Angeles. The aircraft, registration number N334AA, was carrying 81 passengers and 11 crew members when it pushed back from the gate at 7:59 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. The flight was not fully booked, which was typical for Tuesday morning flights, and the hijackers had been able to select seats that would give them strategic advantages during the takeover. Captain John Agonovsky, a 52-year-old veteran pilot with over 20 years of experience, was at the controls, assisted by First Officer Thomas McGinnis. Junior Agonovsky was known as a skilled and experienced pilot who had flown for American Airlines since 1979. He was also a farmer who grew vegetables on his property in Massachusetts and donated much of his produce to Cambodian refugees in the area. The flight attendants included Betty Ong, Amy Sweeney, and others who would soon find themselves in an unimaginable situation. Ong, a 45-year-old veteran flight attendant, had been working for American Airlines for 14 years and was known for her professionalism and calm demeanor. Sweeney, 35, was also an experienced flight attendant who had been with the airline for 12 years. At approximately 8:14 a.m., as Flight 11 was climbing through 26,000 feet over central Massachusetts, the hijacking began. The exact sequence of events remains somewhat unclear, as there were no survivors to provide first-hand accounts, but investigators have pieced together the timeline based on air traffic control recordings, phone calls from flight attendants, and radar data. The hijackers likely used box cutters and knives to overpower the flight crew and gain control of the cockpit. These weapons were legal to carry on aircraft at the time, as the blades were shorter than the 4-inch limit imposed by Federal Aviation Administration regulations. The attackers may have also used mace or pepper spray to subdue passengers and crew members, and some reports suggest they may have claimed to have a bomb. The hijacker strategy was based on the conventional wisdom about hijackings that had prevailed for decades. In traditional hijackings, the perpetrators would take control of an aircraft and make demands, usually for money or the release of prisoners. Passengers and crew were generally advised to cooperate with hijackers and wait for authorities to negotiate a resolution. The concept of using a hijacked aircraft as a weapon was so far outside conventional thinking that few people were prepared for this new type of attack. Flight attendant Betty Ong managed to contact American Airlines Operations Center using an airphone, providing crucial real-time information about the hijacking. In a calm and professional voice, she reported that the hijackers had stabbed 2 flight attendants and that she believed the cockpit had been breached. Her call, which lasted approximately 25 minutes, provided investigators with invaluable insights into what was happening aboard the aircraft. Ong's call began at 8:19 a.m. when she contacted Vanessa Minter, an American Airlines reservations agent in North Carolina. The cockpit is not answering. Somebody's stabbed in business class, and I think there's mace, that we can't breathe. I don't know. I think we're getting hijacked, she said. The call was then transferred to Nydia Gonzalez, a supervisor at American's Operations Center, who stayed on the line with Ong for most of the remainder of the flight. During the call, Ong provided detailed information about the hijackers, including their seat numbers, which helped investigators quickly identify the perpetrators after the attacks. She reported that the hijackers had moved passengers to the back of the plane and that they appeared to have gained access to the cockpit. Her calm professionalism under extreme circumstances provided crucial intelligence about the nature of the attack. Another flight attendant, Amy Sweeney, also made contact with the ground, speaking with American Airlines Flight Services Manager Michael Woodward. She provided additional details about the hijackers and the situation aboard the aircraft. Sweeney's call was made from a seat in the back of the plane, where she had retreated after the hijackers took control of the forward section of the aircraft. Sweeney told Woodward that the hijackers had killed passengers and that the plane was flying erratically. She described seeing the New York City skyline and expressed concern about the aircraft's low altitude and high speed. Her final words, as the plane approached the World Trade Center, were, "I see water and buildings. Oh my God. Oh my God." At 8:21 a.m., Flight 11's transponder was turned off, making it much more difficult for air traffic controllers to track the aircraft. The transponder is a device that broadcasts the aircraft's identity, altitude, and speed to air traffic control radar systems. Without this information, controllers could only track the plane as an unidentified blip on their radar screens. The plane had also deviated from its planned flight path, turning south toward New York City instead of continuing west toward Los Angeles. Air traffic controllers initially assumed they were dealing with a traditional hijacking, where the perpetrators would make demands and eventually land the aircraft at an airport. The concept of using a commercial airliner as a weapon was so far outside the realm of conventional thinking that it took time for authorities to grasp what was actually happening. Boston air traffic controller Pete Zalewski was the first to recognize that something was seriously wrong with Flight 11. When he lost radio contact with the aircraft and saw it deviating from its assigned route, he began trying to re-establish communication. His attempts were unsuccessful, and he soon realized that the aircraft had been hijacked. Meanwhile, at Washington Dulles International Airport, another team of hijackers was preparing to board American Airlines Flight 77. This group, led by Hani Henger, included Khalid al-Midhar, Majmouk, Nawaf al-Hezmi, and Salem al-Hezmi. Like their counterparts in Boston, they passed through security screening without major incident, although some were selected for additional screening. Henger, the pilot of this team, was considered the weakest of the 4 pilot hijackers in terms of flying ability. He had been in the United States since the early 1990s and had attended several flight schools, but his instructors had consistently noted his poor flying skills and lack of English proficiency. Some instructors had even refused to continue training him because of his incompetence. Despite his poor flying skills, Henger had managed to obtain a commercial pilot's license, though he had to take the test multiple times to pass. His selection as a pilot for the operation may have been due to his familiarity with the United States and his ability to remain in the country for extended periods without arousing suspicion. Flight 77 was a Boeing 757-223, scheduled to fly from Washington to Los Angeles. The aircraft, registration number N644A, was carrying 58 passengers and 6 crew members when it departed at 8:20 a.m. The flight was also lightly loaded, which was typical for transcontinental flights on Tuesday mornings. Captain Charles Burlingame III, a former Navy pilot, was the pilot in command, with First Officer David Charlebois as his co-pilot. Burlingame, 51, had been flying for American Airlines since 1979 and was known as an experienced and safety-conscious pilot. He had served in the Navy for 8 years before joining the airline and had flown F-4 Phantom jets during his military service. At Newark International Airport in New Jersey, a third team of hijackers was boarding United Airlines Flight 93. This group, led by Ziad Jarrah, included Ahmed al-Hasnawi, Ahmed al-Nami, and Saeed al-Ghamdi. Flight 93 was a Boeing 757-222, registration number N591UA, scheduled to fly from Newark to San Francisco. The aircraft was carrying 37 passengers and 7 crew members, making it the least crowded of the 4 hijacked flights. Jarrah was perhaps the most westernized of the 4 pilot hijackers. He came from a relatively secular Lebanese family and had a German girlfriend whom he had planned to marry. His path to radicalization was less clear than that of the other pilots, and some investigators have speculated that he may have had doubts about the mission until the very end. The 4th and final team of hijackers was at Logan Airport, preparing to board United Airlines Flight 175, led by Marwan al-Shihi. This group included Fayez Badahamid, Mohand al-Shiri, Hamza al-Ghamdi, and Ahmed al-Ghamdi. Flight 175 was a Boeing 767-222, registration number N612UA, scheduled to fly from Boston to Los Angeles with 56 passengers and 9 crew members aboard. Al-Shahi was Atta's closest associate and had been his roommate during their time in Germany. The 2 men had developed a close friendship and shared a commitment to radical Islam. Al-Shahi was considered more personable than Atta and was better at blending into Western society, but he was equally dedicated to the terrorist cause. As these 4 aircraft took to the skies on what appeared to be a routine Tuesday morning, the first signs that something was amiss began to emerge in air traffic control centers across the country. The hijackings would unfold over the course of approximately 2 hours, during which time the entire American aviation system would be brought to a halt and the nation would come under attack. At 8:24 a.m., air traffic controllers heard what they initially thought was a radio transmission from Flight 11, but which was actually Mohammed Atta speaking to the passengers. "We have some planes," he said, apparently unaware that his microphone was transmitting to air traffic control rather than the aircraft's public address system. "Just stay quiet and you'll be okay. We are returning to the airport." This transmission was the first clear indication that multiple aircraft might be involved in coordinated attacks. The use of the plural planes suggested that Flight 11 was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger plot. However, it would take time for this information to be processed and disseminated to the appropriate authorities. The air traffic controllers who heard Atta's transmission were initially confused about what they were hearing. The voice was clearly not that of Captain Ogonowski, and the message was unlike anything they had heard before in a hijacking situation. It took several minutes for them to realize that they were listening to one of the hijackers and that the aircraft was under the control of terrorists. At 8:37 a.m., Boston Air Traffic Control contacted the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, to report the hijacking of Flight 11. NORAD, which was responsible for defending North American airspace, began scrambling fighter jets from Otis Air National Guard Base on Cape Cod. However, the fighters would not become airborne until 8:52 a.m., and by then, it would be too late to intercept Flight 11. The delay in scrambling the fighters was due to several factors, including confusion about the aircraft's location and heading, uncertainty about the rules of engagement for dealing with hijacked civilian aircraft, and the unprecedented nature of the situation. An ORAD's procedures were designed to deal with threats from foreign military aircraft, not hijacked domestic flights being used as weapons. At 8:46 a.m. and 40 seconds, American Airlines Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center, striking the building between the 93rd and 99th floors at a speed of approximately 466 miles per hour. The impact created a massive fireball and instantly killed everyone aboard the aircraft, as well as hundreds of people in the building. The collision severed elevator cables, stairwells, and emergency exits, trapping many people on the floors above the impact zone. The aircraft's fuel, approximately 10,000 gallons of jet fuel, ignited upon impact and created intense fires that spread throughout multiple floors of the building. The combination of the physical damage from the impact and the intense heat from the fires would prove to be catastrophic for the building's structural integrity. The crash was witnessed by thousands of people in Lower Manhattan and was captured on video by numerous cameras, including those of news crews who happened to be in the area. Initially, many observers assumed they were witnessing a terrible accident, perhaps caused by pilot error or mechanical failure. The idea that a commercial airliner had been deliberately flown into the World Trade Center was so shocking that it took time for people to process what they had actually seen. Jules Naudet, a French filmmaker who was making a documentary about New York City firefighters, captured the only known footage of the first plane hitting the North Tower. He had been filming firefighters responding to a gas leak in Lower Manhattan when Flight 11 flew overhead and crashed into the building. His footage would become one of the most important historical records of the attacks. News of the crash spread rapidly, with television networks interrupting their regular programming to report on the incident. At 8:48 a.m., CNN became the first network to break into programming with a live report from the scene. Carol Lynn, the anchor on duty, told viewers, "This just in. You are looking at obviously a very disturbing live shot there. That is the World Trade Center, and we have unconfirmed reports this morning that a plane has crashed into one of the towers of the World Trade Center." Other networks quickly followed suit, and within minutes, millions of Americans were watching live coverage of the burning North Tower. The initial reports were cautious and speculative, with anchors and reporters struggling to understand what had happened and whether it was an accident or something more sinister. As emergency responders rushed to the scene and news crews provided continuous coverage, United Airlines Flight 175 was approaching New York City from the south. At 8:42 a.m., his flight had also been hijacked, with Marwan al-Shahi and his team overpowering the crew and taking control of the aircraft. Unlike Flight 11, there were no recorded phone calls from Flight 175, so less is known about the specific details of this hijacking. The hijacking of Flight 175 followed a similar pattern to that of Flight 11, with the terrorists using knives and box cutters to overpower the crew and gain access to the cockpit. The aircraft's transponder was turned off at 8:47 a.m., just 1 minute after Flight 11 had crashed into the North Tower. At 9:03 a.m. and 2 seconds, Flight 175 crashed into the South Tower of the World Trade Center, striking the building between the 77th and 85th floors at a speed of approximately 590 miles per hour. This second impact was broadcast live on television, as news cameras were already focused on the World Trade Center following the first crash. The sight of the second plane hitting the South Tower made it immediately clear that America was under attack. The impact of Flight 175 was even more devastating than that of Flight 11. as the aircraft was traveling faster and struck the building at a slightly different angle. The crash created another massive fireball and caused significant structural damage to the South Tower. Like the North Tower, the South Tower's emergency exits and stairwells were severely damaged, trapping many people on the upper floors. The live television coverage of the second impact had a profound psychological effect on viewers around the world. Millions of people watched in horror as the aircraft disappeared into the building and emerged as a fireball on the other side. The image of the second plane hitting the tower became one of the most iconic and traumatic images in television history. The realization that the United States was under coordinated attack sent shockwaves through the government and military establishments. At 9:05 a.m., President Bush, who was reading to elementary school children in Sarasota, Florida, was informed of the second crash by his chief of staff, Andrew Card, who whispered in his ear, "A second plane hit the second tower. America is under attack." The president's reaction to this news was captured on video and would later become a subject of controversy. Bush continued reading with the children for several more minutes before excusing himself, leading some critics to argue that he should have responded more quickly to the crisis. Supporters countered that his calm demeanor helped avoid panic and that he was following the advice of his security detail. The Federal Aviation Administration, recognizing the unprecedented nature of the threat, began taking extraordinary measures to protect the nation's airspace. At 9:08 a.m., the FIA banned all takeoffs of flights going to New York City or through the airspace around the city. This was followed by increasingly broad restrictions on air traffic as the scope of the attacks became clear. The decision to restrict air traffic was made by FAA Administrator Jane Garvey and other senior officials who recognized that commercial aircraft were being used as weapons. The agency had never faced a situation like this before, and officials had to make critical decisions with limited information and no established procedures to guide them. Meanwhile, American Airlines Flight 77 was approaching Washington, D.C. after being hijacked at approximately 8:54 a.m. The aircraft had been flying west toward its intended destination of Los Angeles when Hani Hanjour and his team took control. Like the other hijacked flights, Flight 77's transponder was turned off, making it difficult for air traffic controllers to track its exact location. The hijacking of Flight 77 was particularly challenging for air traffic controllers because the aircraft disappeared from radar screens over Ohio and was not seen again until it reappeared near Washington, D.C. During this time, controllers were unsure whether the aircraft had crashed, landed at an airport, or was still in the air and heading toward a target. At 9:25 a.m., the FAA's command center notified NORAD that Flight 77 was missing and might be headed toward Washington. Fighter jets were scrambled from Langley Air Force Base in Virginia, but they were initially sent east over the Atlantic Ocean due to confusion about the aircraft's location and heading. The fighters were not in position to intercept Flight 77 when it reached its target. At 9:37 a.m., Flight 77 crashed into the western side of the Pentagon, the headquarters of the United States Department of Defense. The aircraft struck the building at ground level, penetrating 3 of the Pentagon's 5 rings and causing a massive fire. The crash killed all 64 people aboard the aircraft and 125 people in the building, making it the deadliest attack on the Pentagon in its history. The attack on the Pentagon was particularly shocking because it demonstrated that even the most secure government buildings were vulnerable to this new form of terrorism. The Pentagon, which housed the leadership of the world's most powerful military, had been successfully attacked by 19 men armed with nothing more than box cutters and the element of surprise. The Pentagon had been designed to withstand conventional attacks, including bombing and artillery fire, but it was not prepared for the impact of a large commercial aircraft traveling at high speed. The building's structure was severely damaged, and the resulting fire burned for hours, destroying offices and equipment and forcing the evacuation of much of the building. As news of the Pentagon attack spread, panic began to grip Washington. D.C. government buildings were evacuated, and officials scrambled to secure other potential targets. The White House, the Capitol, and other prominent landmarks were seen as likely targets for additional attacks. Secret Service agents rushed Vice President Dick Cheney to a secure bunker beneath the White House, while other officials were moved to undisclosed locations. At 9:42 a.m., the FAA made the unprecedented decision to ground all aircraft in United States airspace, ordering more than 4,000 flights to land at the nearest airport immediately. This decision, known as SCATANA, Security Control of Air Traffic and Air Navigation Aids, had never been implemented before and demonstrated the severity of the crisis. The decision to ground all aircraft was made by FAA Administrator Jane Garvey in consultation with other senior officials. It was a drastic measure that would have enormous economic and logistical consequences, but it was seen as necessary to prevent additional attacks. Within hours, the skies over America, normally filled with hundreds of aircraft, were empty except for military and emergency flights. The fourth hijacked aircraft, United Airlines Flight 93, was still in the air and heading toward Washington, D.C. This flight had been delayed in taking off from Newark, which meant that the hijacking occurred later than on the other three flights. The delay would prove to be crucial, as it gave passengers on Flight 93 time to learn about the other attacks through phone calls to family members and friends. Flight 93 was hijacked at approximately 9:28 a.m., about 40 minutes after takeoff. Ziad Jarrah and his team overpowered the crew and took control of the aircraft, turning it around and heading toward Washington. The hijackers' intended target remains a matter of some debate, but most investigators believe they were planning to attack either the White House or the United States Capitol. The hijacking of Flight 93 was more chaotic than the others, possibly because the passengers and crew were aware of the other attacks and were prepared to resist. There were reports of a struggle in the cockpit, and the aircraft's flight path was more erratic than those of the other hijacked planes. Unlike the passengers on the other three flights, those aboard Flight 93 had the advantage of knowing what had happened in New York and Washington. Through phone calls made using earphones and cell phones, they learned that hijacked aircraft had been used as weapons against the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. This knowledge fundamentally changed the dynamic aboard Flight 93. Several passengers, including Todd Beamer, Mark Bingham, Tom Burnett, and Jeremy Glick, began organizing a plan to retake control of the aircraft. These men, along with other passengers and crew members, understood that they were likely facing certain death if they did nothing, and they made the heroic decision to fight back against the hijackers. Todd Beamer, a 32-year-old software salesman from New Jersey, made a phone call to GTE operator Lisa Jefferson that would become one of the most famous accounts of the passengers' actions. Beamer had been unable to reach his wife and had been connected to Jefferson, who stayed on the line with him for 13 minutes. During the call, Beamer described the situation aboard the aircraft and discussed the passengers' plan to retake control. After learning about the other attacks and discussing the situation with his fellow passengers, Beamer asked Jefferson to pray with him. He then said goodbye and uttered the now famous words, "Let's roll," before joining the effort to storm the cockpit. Jefferson stayed on the line and heard the sounds of the passengers' revolt. Mark Bingham, a 31-year-old public relations executive from California, called his mother to tell her about the hijacking and to say goodbye. During a brief call, he told her, "I'm on a flight from Newark to San Francisco, and there are 3 guys who have taken over the plane, and they say they have a bomb." He also told her that he loved her and asked her to call the authorities. Tom Burnett, a 38-year-old business executive from California, made several calls to his wife, Dina, during which he described the situation and the passengers' plan to fight back. In his final call, he told her, "I know we're all going to die. There's 3 of us who are going to do something about it. I love you, honey." He then hung up and joined the revolt. Jeremy Glick, a 31-year-old sales manager from New Jersey, called his wife lies and described the hijackers and their weapons. He told her about the passengers' plan to rush the hijackers and asked for her opinion. She encouraged him to do what he thought was right, and he told her he loved her before ending the call. The passengers' revolt began at approximately 9:57 a.m. as they charged toward the front of the aircraft in an attempt to overpower the hijackers. The cockpit voice recorder captured the sounds of the struggle, including the hijackers' increasingly desperate attempts to maintain control of the aircraft. The recording reveals the chaos and violence of the final moments, as passengers fought desperately to prevent the aircraft from reaching its target. Faced with the passengers' uprising, Ziad Jarrah began rolling the aircraft from side to side and pitching the nose up and down in an attempt to knock the passengers off their feet. However, the passengers continued their assault on the cockpit, and it became clear that they would soon break through the door. The cockpit voice recorder captured Jarrah's final words as he realized that the passengers were about to break into the cockpit. "Is that it? Shall we finish it off?" he asked his fellow hijacker. "No, not yet," came the reply. "When they all come, we finish it off." Moments later, Jarrah could be heard saying, pull it down," as he apparently tried to crash the aircraft before the passengers could regain control. At 10:03 a.m., Flight 93 crashed into a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, killing all 44 people aboard. The aircraft hit the ground at a speed of over 500 miles per hour, creating a crater and scattering debris over a wide area. The crash occurred just 20 minutes flying time from Washington, D.C., leading many to believe that the passengers' actions prevented an attack on the nation's capital. The crash site in Pennsylvania was unlike the others, as the aircraft had hit the ground in a rural area rather than a populated urban center. The impact created a crater about 30 feet deep and 50 feet wide, and debris was scattered over an area of several acres. The force of the impact was so great that very little of the aircraft remained intact. Back in New York, the situation at the World Trade Center was becoming increasingly desperate. The fires caused by the aircraft impacts were burning intensely, fueled by thousands of gallons of jet fuel and office furnishings. The extreme heat was weakening the steel structure of both towers, and engineers later determined that the building's unique design made them particularly vulnerable to this type of attack. The World Trade Center towers had been designed with a unique structural system that relied on a central core of steel columns surrounded by an outer shell of steel, columns connected by lightweight floor trusses. This design allowed for large, open floor spaces, but made the buildings vulnerable to the type of damage caused by the aircraft impacts and resulting fires. The intense heat from the fires caused the steel floor trusses to expand and eventually sag, pulling the outer walls of the buildings inward. This process, known as progressive collapse, would ultimately lead to the failure of the entire structural system and the collapse of both towers. Hundreds of people trapped on the upper floors of both towers faced an impossible choice: remain in the buildings and face almost certain death from fire and smoke, or jump from windows in a desperate attempt to escape. The sight of people jumping from the towers became one of the most haunting images of September 11th, representing the absolute desperation of those trapped inside. The decision to jump was made by individuals who found themselves in an impossible situation, with no hope of rescue and facing unbearable conditions from heat, smoke, and fire. These tragic deaths highlighted the horror of the situation and the impossible choices faced by those trapped in the buildings. Emergency responders, including firefighters, police officers, and paramedics, rushed into both towers in an attempt to rescue as many people as possible. These brave men and women climbed dozens of flights of stairs while carrying heavy equipment, passing streams of evacuees heading in the opposite direction. Many of these first responders would not survive the day. The New York City Fire Department responded with unprecedented resources, sending more than 200 units and 400 firefighters to the World Trade Center. Fire Chief Peter Gansey, Jr. established a command post in the lobby of the North Tower and began coordinating rescue operations. The department's strategy was to establish staging areas on various floors and work systematically to evacuate people from the upper floors. The police department of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which had jurisdiction over the World Trade Center, also responded with significant resources. Officers helped evacuate people from the buildings and provided security for the rescue operations. Many Port Authority police officers were killed when the towers collapsed. At 9:59 a.m., the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapsed, falling in approximately 10 seconds and creating a massive cloud of dust and debris that engulfed Lower Manhattan. The collapse was caused by the failure of the building's steel structure, which had been weakened by the intense fires burning on multiple floors. The collapse of the South Tower was a shock to everyone watching, as few people had anticipated that the buildings might actually fall down. The towers had been designed to withstand the impact of a large aircraft, but the designers had not anticipated the effects of the massive fires that would result from such an impact. The collapse began when the floors above the impact zone could no longer be supported by the damaged and heat-weakened structure below. The upper portion of the building fell as a single unit, crushing the floors below in a progressive collapse that brought down the entire 110-story structure in a matter of seconds. The collapse created a massive dust cloud that covered much of Lower Manhattan in a thick layer of pulverized concrete, gypsum, and other building materials. The dust cloud was so dense that visibility was reduced to just a few feet, and many people in the area were temporarily blinded and had difficulty breathing. At 10:28 a.m., the North Tower also collapsed, falling in a similar manner and creating another enormous dust cloud. The collapse of both towers killed thousands of people, including office workers who had been unable to evacuate, emergency responders who were inside the buildings, and people on the streets below who were caught in the falling debris. The collapse of the Twin Towers marked the end of the active phase of the September 11th attacks, but the day's trauma was far from over. Lower Manhattan was covered in a thick layer of dust and debris, and the air was filled with smoke and the acrid smell of burning materials. Emergency responders and volunteers worked frantically to search for survivors in the rubble, but few would be found alive. The attacks had killed nearly 3,000 people, making September 11th the deadliest terrorist attack in world history and the deadliest day on American soil since the Civil War. The victims included people from more than 90 countries, reflecting the international nature of the World Trade Center's workforce and the global impact of the attacks. The victims of the attacks came from all walks of life and represented a cross-section of American society. They included office workers, firefighters, police officers, paramedics, airline passengers and crew members, and visitors to the World Trade Center. The youngest victim was 2 years old, while the oldest was 85. The diversity of the victims reflected the cosmopolitan nature of New York City and the global reach of the terrorist attack. In the immediate aftermath of the attacks, the United States government took unprecedented steps to secure the country and prevent additional attacks. All commercial aviation was suspended for several days, stranding thousands of passengers around the world. The military was placed on high alert, and fighter jets began patrolling major cities. The suspension of commercial aviation had enormous economic and logistical consequences. Thousands of flights were canceled, and passengers were stranded at airports around the world. The airline industry, which was already struggling financially, faced massive losses and required government assistance to remain viable. President Bush, who had been moved to secure locations throughout the day for his safety, addressed the nation that evening from the Oval Office. In his speech, he declared that thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, and vowed that the United States would make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. The president's address was watched by more than 80 million Americans and set the tone for the nation's response to the attacks. Bush's declaration that the United States would not distinguish between terrorists and those who harbor them became known as the Bush Doctrine and would guide American foreign policy for years to come. The investigation into the attacks began immediately, with the FBI launching the largest criminal investigation in its history. Investigators worked to identify the hijackers, trace their movements in the months leading up to the attacks, and uncover the network that had supported them. Within days, authorities had identified all 19 hijackers and begun mapping their connections to al-Qaeda. The FBI's investigation, codenamed Pentagon Twin Towers bombing, involved thousands of agents and analysts working around the clock to piece together the details of the plot. The investigation examined everything from the hijackers' financial records to their travel patterns to their communications with al-Qaeda operatives overseas. The economic impact of the attacks was immediate and severe. The New York Stock Exchange and Nasdaq were closed for 4 trading days, the longest shutdown since the Great Depression. When markets reopened on September 17th, the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell 684 points, representing a 7.1% decline and the largest single-day point drop in history at that time. The airline industry was particularly hard hit, as passengers became reluctant to fly and new security measures made air travel more cumbersome and time-consuming. Several major airlines filed for bankruptcy in the months following the attacks, and the industry required billions of dollars in government assistance to remain viable. The attacks also had profound psychological effects on the American people. Surveys conducted in the weeks following September 11th showed that a majority of Americans were experiencing symptoms of stress and anxiety related to the attacks. Many people reported difficulty sleeping, concentrating, or feeling safe in public places. The psychological impact of the attacks was amplified by the constant media coverage and the graphic images that were broadcast repeatedly on television. The sight of the planes hitting the towers, people jumping from the buildings, and the collapse of the structures created lasting trauma for many viewers. The sense of vulnerability that many Americans felt was compounded by a series of anthrax attacks that began just 1 week after September 11th. Letters containing anthrax spores were mailed to news media offices and government officials, killing 5 people and infecting 17 others. Although these attacks were later determined to be unrelated to al-Qaeda, they added to the climate of fear and uncertainty that gripped the nation. The anthrax attacks began on September 18th, when letters containing the deadly bacteria were mailed to several news organizations, including ABC, CBS, NBC, and the New York Post. Additional letters were sent to Democratic Senators Tom Daschle and Patrick Leahy. The attacks caused widespread panic and led to the evacuation and decontamination of several government buildings. In response to the attacks, Congress quickly passed the U.S. Patriot Act, which significantly expanded the government's surveillance and law enforcement powers. The legislation, which was signed into law by President Bush on October 26, 2001, gave federal agencies broader authority to monitor communications, conduct searches, and detain suspected terrorists. The Patriot Act was controversial from the beginning, with critics arguing that it gave the government too much power and threatened civil liberties. Supporters countered that the new powers were necessary to prevent future terrorist attacks and that appropriate safeguards were in place to prevent abuse. The creation of the Department of Homeland Security in 2002 represented the largest reorganization of the federal government since the creation of the Department of Defense in 1947. The new department consolidated 22 existing agencies and employed more than 240,000 people, making it the third largest department in the federal government. The Department of Homeland Security was created to coordinate the nation's efforts to prevent terrorist attacks and respond to natural disasters and other emergencies. The department brought together agencies that had previously operated independently, including the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the Customs Service, the Coast Guard, and the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Airport security was completely overhauled with the creation of the Transportation Security Administration, SEA, and the implementation of new screening procedures. Passengers were now required to remove shoes, belts, and jackets, and liquids were restricted to small containers. Armed air marshals were placed on flights, and cockpit doors were reinforced to prevent unauthorized access. The changes to airport security were dramatic and permanent, fundamentally altering the experience of air travel for millions of passengers. The new procedures were designed to prevent the type of weapons used by the 9/11's hijackers from being brought aboard aircraft, but they also made air travel more time-consuming and inconvenient. The foreign policy implications of the September 11th attacks were equally significant. President Bush articulated what became known as the Bush Doctrine, which stated that the United States would take preemptive action against countries that harbored or supported terrorists. This doctrine would serve as the justification for military interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq. On October 7, 2001, less than a month after the attacks, the United States launched Operation Enduring Freedom, the invasion of Afghanistan. The primary objectives were to destroy al-Qaeda's training camps, capture or kill Osama bin Laden and other terrorist leaders, and remove the Taliban government that had provided sanctuary to the terrorists. The initial phase of the Afghanistan campaign was remarkably successful, with Taliban forces quickly collapsing in the face of American air power and special operations forces working with local allies. The Northern Alliance, a coalition of Afghan groups opposed to the Taliban, provided ground forces and local knowledge that proved crucial to the success of the operation. Kabul, the Afghan capital, fell on November 13, 2001, and by December, the Taliban had been driven from power. However, many Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters escaped to Pakistan or melted away into the Afghan countryside, where they would later regroup and launch an insurgency against the new Afghan government and international forces. However, bin Laden and many other al-Qaeda leaders managed to escape during the Battle of Tora Bora in December 2001, fleeing across the border into Pakistan. This failure to capture the architect of the September 11th attacks would have long-lasting consequences, as bin Laden continued to inspire and direct terrorist activities from his hiding places. The Battle of Tora Bora was a critical moment in the early stages of the war in Afghanistan. Intelligence reports indicated that bin Laden and other senior al-Qaeda leaders were hiding in the cave complexes of the Tora Bora Mountains near the Pakistani border. However, the decision to rely primarily on Afghan allies rather than American ground forces allowed many of the terrorists to escape. The hunt for bin Laden became a central focus of American counterterrorism efforts for the next decade. Intelligence agencies spent billions of dollars and deployed thousands of personnel in the effort to locate and eliminate the al-Qaeda leader. The search involved sophisticated surveillance technologies, human intelligence networks, and cooperation with intelligence services around the world. Meanwhile, the investigation into the September 11th attacks continued to reveal the extent of the intelligence failures that had allowed the plot to succeed. The 9/11's Commission, established by Congress in 2002, conducted an exhaustive investigation into the attacks and published its findings in July 2004. The commission was chaired by former New Jersey Governor Thomas Keane and former Indiana Congressman Lee Hamilton. The bipartisan panel included 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats and was tasked with providing a complete account of the circumstances surrounding the attacks and recommendations for preventing future attacks. The Commission's report identified numerous missed opportunities and systemic failures that had prevented the intelligence community from detecting and disrupting the plot. These included the failure to share information between agencies, inadequate analysis of available intelligence, and a lack of imagination in considering how terrorists might use commercial aircraft as weapons. One of the most significant revelations was the extent to which the CIA and FBI had failed to communicate with each other about known al-Qaeda operatives. The CIA had identified Khalid al-Midhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi as potential terrorists as early as January 2000, but this information was not shared with the FBI until August 2001, just weeks before the attacks. The Commission also criticized the immigration system for failing to detect the hijackers' presence in the United States. Several of the hijackers had violated the terms of their visas or had overstayed their permitted time in the country, but these violations were not detected by immigration authorities. The report made 41 recommendations for improving national security, including the creation of a Director of National Intelligence to coordinate the activities of the various intelligence agencies, the establishment of a National Counterterrorism Center, and improvements to information sharing between federal, state, and local authorities. Many of these recommendations were implemented in the years following the report's publication, leading to significant changes in how the United States approaches counterterrorism and intelligence gathering. The Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004 created the position of Director of National Intelligence and established the National Counterterrorism Center. However, debates continue about the effectiveness of these measures and the appropriate balance between security and civil liberties. Critics argue that the intelligence reforms have created new bureaucracies without fundamentally solving the problems that allowed the 9/11 attacks to succeed, while supporters contend that the changes have made the country safer. The September 11th attacks also had a profound impact on American culture and society. The attacks challenged many Americans' sense of security and invulnerability, leading to increased support for military action abroad and enhanced security measures at home. The phrase 9/11s changed everything became a common refrain, reflecting the widespread belief that the attacks had fundamentally altered American life. The attacks also led to increased scrutiny and suspicion of Muslim Americans and Arab Americans, many of whom faced discrimination and harassment in the months and years following September 11th. Hate crimes against Muslims increased dramatically, and many Muslim Americans reported feeling like they were viewed with suspicion by their fellow citizens. The Council on American Islamic Relations reported a 1,700% increase in hate crimes against Muslims in 2001 compared to the previous year. Mosques were vandalized, Muslim women wearing headscarves were harassed, and some Muslims were physically attacked. The backlash against Muslim Americans was one of the most troubling consequences of the attacks. At the same time, the attacks also brought out remarkable displays of heroism, compassion, and unity. The actions of the passengers on Flight 93, the bravery of the first responders who rushed into the burning towers, and the countless acts of kindness shown by ordinary Americans in the aftermath of the attacks demonstrated the best of human nature in the face of unimaginable evil. The heroism of the first responders became a defining image of September 11th. Firefighters, police officers, and paramedics rushed into the burning towers without hesitation, knowing that they were risking their lives to save others. 343 firefighters, 72 police officers, and 55 other first responders died in the attacks, making the ultimate sacrifice in service to their fellow citizens. The rebuilding of the World Trade Center site became a symbol of American resilience and determination. After years of planning and construction, One World Trade Center, also known as Freedom Tower, was completed in 2014. The building stands 1,776 feet tall, a deliberate reference to the year of American independence, and serves as both a memorial to those who died and a symbol of the nation's refusal to be defeated by terrorism. The design of One World Trade Center incorporated numerous security features that were not present in the original towers. The building has a reinforced concrete core, blast-resistant base, and advanced fire safety systems. The design reflects the lessons learned from the September 11th attacks and the determination to create a safer building. The National September 11th Memorial, which opened on the 10th anniversary of the attacks, features 2 reflecting pools built in the footprints of the original Twin Towers. The names of all 2,977 victims of the September 11th attacks, as well as the 6 people killed in the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, are inscribed around the edges of the pools. The memorial serves as a place of remembrance and reflection, allowing visitors to honor the memory of those who died and to contemplate the events that changed the world. The adjacent museum houses artifacts from the attacks, including pieces of the destroyed buildings, personal belongings of victims, and recordings of phone calls made from the hijacked aircraft. The museum's collection includes more than 70,000 items, ranging from large pieces of steel from the towers to personal items like wallets, jewelry, and photographs. The museum also features oral histories from survivors, family members of victims, and first responders, providing a human perspective on the tragedy. The long-term consequences of the September 11th attacks continue to shape American foreign policy and domestic security measures more than 2 decades later. The War on Terror, launched in response to the attacks, has involved military operations in dozens of countries and has cost trillions of dollars and thousands of American lives. The invasion of Iraq in 2003, which was justified in part by claims that Saddam Hussein's government had connections to al-Qaeda and possessed weapons of mass destruction, proved to be highly controversial. No evidence of significant ties between Hussein and al-Qaeda was ever found, and no weapons of mass destruction were discovered, leading to widespread criticism of the decision to invade. The Iraq War, which lasted from 2003 to 2011, resulted in the deaths of more than 4,400 American service members and hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians. The war also destabilized the region and contributed to the rise of new terrorist groups, including the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS. The decision to invade Iraq was based on intelligence that later proved to be flawed or fabricated. The Bush administration argued that Hussein posed an imminent threat to the United States and its allies, but subsequent investigations found that the intelligence community had overestimated the threat and that some officials had exaggerated the evidence to support their case for war. The war in Afghanistan, meanwhile, became the longest war in American history, lasting nearly 20 years before ending with the withdrawal of U.S. forces in August 2021. The Taliban, which had been driven from power in 2001, returned to control most of the country, raising questions about what had been accomplished during 2 decades of military involvement. The withdrawal from Afghanistan was chaotic and controversial, with the Taliban quickly overrunning Afghan government forces and retaking control of the country. The final evacuation from Kabul airport was marked by desperate scenes of Afghans trying to flee the country and a suicide bombing that killed 13 American service members and more than 170 Afghan civilians. The hunt for Osama bin Laden finally ended on May 2, 2011, when U.S. Navy SEALs killed the al-Qaeda leader during a raid on his compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan. Bin Laden's death was seen as a significant victory in the fight against terrorism, but it did not end the threat posed by al-Qaeda or other terrorist groups. The operation to kill bin Laden, codenamed Operation Neptune Spear, was the result of years of intelligence work and careful planning. The CIA had tracked bin Laden to his compound in Abbottabad through a network of couriers and surveillance operations. The raid was carried out by SEAL Team 6 and lasted approximately 40 minutes. The methods used to track down bin Laden, including enhanced interrogation techniques and extensive surveillance programs, became the subject of intense debate about the appropriate limits of government power in the fight against terrorism. The revelation in 2013 of the extent of the National Security Agency surveillance programs sparked a national conversation about privacy rights and government overreach. The NSA surveillance programs, revealed by former contractor Edward Snowden, included the bulk collection of telephone metadata from American citizens and extensive monitoring of Internet communications. The programs were justified as necessary for national security, but critics argued that they violated the Fourth Amendment and represented an unprecedented expansion of government surveillance powers. The September 11th attacks also had lasting effects on international relations and global security. The attacks demonstrated that non-state actors could inflict devastating damage on even the world's most powerful nations, leading to increased cooperation between countries in counterterrorism efforts. The attacks also contributed to a shift in the global balance of power, as the United States became increasingly focused on counterterrorism at the expense of other foreign policy priorities. This shift allowed other powers, particularly China and Russia, to expand their influence in regions where American attention was diverted. The rise of social media and the Internet has also changed the nature of terrorism and counterterrorism efforts since September 11th. Terrorist groups have become adept at using online platforms to recruit followers, spread propaganda, and coordinate attacks. This has required law enforcement and intelligence agencies to develop new capabilities and techniques for monitoring and disrupting online terrorist activities. The COVID-19 pandemic, which began in 2020, has been compared to September 11th in terms of its impact on American society and the changes it has brought to daily life. Like the terrorist attacks, the pandemic has led to new security measures, changes in government powers, and shifts in public attitudes about risk and safety. As we reflect on the events of September 11, 2001, and their aftermath, it is important to remember both the tremendous loss of life and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of tragedy. The attacks revealed the vulnerability of modern society to determine terrorists, but they also demonstrated the capacity of people to come together in times of crisis and to rebuild in the face of destruction. The lessons of September 11th continue to inform debates about national security, civil liberties, and America's role in the world. The challenge for future generations will be to maintain vigilance against terrorist threats while preserving the democratic values and freedoms that make America worth defending. The story of September 11th is ultimately a story about the choices that individuals and nations make in the face of evil and adversity. The hijackers chose to embrace hatred and violence, seeking to destroy innocent lives in service of their twisted ideology. The passengers on Flight 93 chose to fight back, sacrificing their own lives to prevent even greater destruction. The first responders chose to run toward danger, risking everything to save others. In the years since the attacks, Americans have continued to make choices about how to respond to the threat of terrorism and how to balance security with freedom. These choices have not always been easy or uncontroversial, but they reflect the ongoing struggle to build a safer and more just world. The memory of September 11th serves as a reminder of both human capacity for evil and the power of courage, compassion, and resilience in the face of that evil. As we continue to grapple with the challenges of terrorism, extremism, and violence in our world, the lessons of that terrible day remain as relevant as ever. The 19 men who carried out the September 11th attacks believed that they could break the spirit of the American people and force the United States to withdraw from the world stage. In this, they failed completely. While the attacks caused tremendous pain and suffering, they also revealed the strength and determination of a nation that refuses to be intimidated by those who would use violence to achieve their goals. The story of September 11th is far from over, as its effects continue to ripple through American society and international relations. But as we remember the victims of that day and honor the heroes who responded to the crisis, we can take comfort in the knowledge that the values they died defending, freedom, democracy, and human dignity, remain as strong as ever. The attacks of September 11th, 2001 changed the world in ways that are still being felt today. They demonstrated the vulnerability of modern society to asymmetric threats and the need for constant vigilance against those who would use violence to achieve their political goals. But they also showed the resilience of the human spirit and the power of ordinary people to do extraordinary things in the face of unimaginable evil. As we continue to live with the consequences of that terrible day, we must remember that the best way to honor the memory of those who died is to continue building a world where such attacks become impossible, not through the elimination of all risk, which is impossible, but through the promotion of justice, understanding, and peace among all peoples. The legacy of September 11th is complex and multifaceted, encompassing both the tragedy of that day and the remarkable response of individuals and institutions in its aftermath. It is a story of loss and grief, but also of courage and hope. It is a reminder of the worst that humans can do to each other, but also of the best that we can be when we stand together against hatred and violence. In the end, the story of September 11th is not just about the events of a single day, but about the ongoing struggle between those who would use violence to divide us and those who work to build bridges of understanding and cooperation. It is a story that continues to unfold, and one in which each of us has a role to play in shaping its ultimate conclusion.